Okay, here we go. All right, hello everyone. My name is Kristen Hunter, and on behalf of EXL Events and the Avoca Group, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on utilizing proactive risk management mapping as an effective oversight tool. I just have a few things to go over before we get things started. First, if you enjoy this webinar and the topic is of interest for you, then consider attending our related conference, the 7th Clinical Quality Oversight Forum, which is taking place October 17th to 19th in Philadelphia. This event attracts over 150 senior-level clinical quality, compliance, and operation professionals, mostly from pharma, biotech, and device companies, and offers an interactive environment to share strategies for ensuring trial integrity by effectively assessing, optimizing, and managing the quality of clinical vendors and sites. We'll be sending you a link to access more information on this conference following the webinar, and you can always reach out to me directly with questions. So now on to today's webinar. We will be providing you with the PDF version of the slides presented, so look for that in an email following the conclusion of the webinar. If you look on your screen, under the Avoca Group logo on the left side, you should see a green Q&A box. Feel free to use this to submit questions at any time during the webinar. There are several built-in pauses during the presentation to address any questions that have been submitted. But please keep in mind that we do have several hundred people that are signed up for this webinar, so depending on the number of questions that come in, we may not be able to answer them all. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can, but if you have a burning question that was not answered, please feel free to email me directly following the webinar, and I'll do my best to get you your answer. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Steve Whitaker, who is the Executive Director for the Avoca Quality Consortium and Senior Consultant for the Avoca Group, where he conducts quality workshops, executive-level consulting for pharmaceutical quality, clinical development, project management, sourcing, alliance, and relationship management. The Avoca Group is the driving force behind continuous improvement of outsourced clinical research. Through Avoca's industry research expertise, 62-plus consortium members, and body of over 250 tools that empower and enable drug development teams, Avoca helps bring medicines to patients in a more effective manner. Steve has a wealth of experiences through years of drug development leadership roles. He retired from Eli Lilly in December of 2009, where he served as Chief Operating Officer / Senior Director of Operations and Project Management for the cardiovascular acute care platform. As the leader of the Global Clinical Research Sourcing Office, he established Lilly's first corporate strategy and operational design for outsourcing global clinical development to CRO preferred partners. So now I'll pass control over to Steve to present this webinar on risk mapping in clinical oversight. So wait one moment while I pass that control.
Okay, so hello everybody, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So we are really excited about the opportunity to share with you the aspects of utilizing proactive risk management, especially from a mapping perspective for effective clinical oversight. And we're going to share with you some leading practice processes and tools. So first, what I would like to do is to clarify what we're going to cover in terms of topics. We're going to really address the aspects of need for risk mapping and the processes and tools, especially in the context of programs that are outsourced between sponsors to providers, and the oversight aspects required to ensure that the programs are running in an effective fashion. In addition, though, before we get into many of those specific aspects of risk mapping, it's going to be relevant for us to make sure we're all understanding the terminology that's used and the elements of risk management. So I will spend time on that. Also, we're going to look at proactive risk, but also opportunity management. And opportunity management is oftentimes less understood or less considered, but there are frequently situations where opportunities are lost because we simply aren't taking advantage of those. So it's not necessarily the normal mode of operation, but there could be opportunities where we could take it to a higher level. And these are utilizing the same tools to consider those types of things. We're going to look, though, specifically at how lessons learned within the aspects of proactive risk and opportunity management can help us by utilization of blueprints. And I'm going to give more details about what I mean by a blueprint and the incorporation of lessons learned. We'll also talk about the elements of the actual risk mapping processes, and we're going to share some leading practice tools. We will be looking at the integration into actual clinical risk plans or clinical development plans across organizations and across sponsors and providers. And we'll look at the outputs and the impact to those operations. So first, let's start in terms of looking for the need in terms of risk mapping. And I'm going to clarify, as I said, some terminology and some definitions. First and foremost, risk, as most understand it, is not an active issue. It's very important to recognize that there are possible risks that could be unpleasant or bad outcomes, and they may cause other implications or carry on complications. So risks relative to issues are that issues are active problems. They are occurring right now. They are already impacting the aspects of the programs. So as a result of that, it's important to recognize that from my experience, and as I've networked with many different companies over the years, it is not unusual for many companies to, I think, live the culture of issue management versus risk management. Issue management, as most of us recognize, is that behavior where we get into the emotional energy, and oftentimes there's the backdoor concerns, things are brought up, and it's usually high energy and high emotion to address the issues. So we're going to focus more on how we can address that cultural behavior, what the reasons are for that issue management to be dominant, and why risk management oftentimes seems difficult to implement, and how through this risk mapping and risk process, it can be more effective and more successful from that perspective and actually become part of the culture versus contrary to the culture. Risk management, as we look at it, though, also must tie into decision-making processes. And those decision-making processes must be proactive. And that because they're proactive, then again, it helps us live a culture of risk prevention versus the firefighting that we recognize in issue management. So the 5 aspects of decision-making is about what are the risks. So we need to ask that question. We need to know which risks potentially erode the most value. Now we're going to look at the aspects of cost, but cost is only one component. Value is a greater parameter to evaluate when it comes to the potential for risk management and the erosion of total value for programs. And I'll talk more about that. Also, from the opposite perspective, if we mitigate risks, how can we choose those risks that will actually protect the most value? Then also, if to the risks that mitigation resources should be allocated, we recognize that there are numerous risks. And risks, as I had indicated before, is a probability that something will occur. So as a result of that, it is uncertain that risks actually will ever become an issue. And some risks, when they become issues, may not be significant in nature or have huge implications. So it's important to know which will really receive the precious and the scarce resources that we have. And then finally, given the expenditure of risk mitigation resources, are there residual liabilities that are still there? Because by risk mitigation does not mean that we absolutely can or will succeed at preventing all risks. So we need to look at the liability that still exists and what we will do in case of those situations. So let's look at that a little bit more deeply. from a risk, a cost, and a value perspective. So when we look at risk, we want to look at these types of questions. Does the organization understand the risks it faces? And what I mean by that is, generally speaking, most individuals will say, yes, I understand the kinds of risks that we face. But what really doesn't come down to reality is the specificity of those risks for a given program or a given project at any moment in time. And while we generally may know that there are risks that will have things such as enrollment delays, we will have risks of study drug supply challenges, we will have other potential risks within the conduct of a clinical trial. Those are general and at a high level, and oftentimes we don't map those very specifically to a given program at a given moment in time and have the risks prompted to the right decision makers to act upon them. So the second bullet says, does the organization understand what the key risks are and the timing implications for those? So as a result, the third bullet, does the organization really effectively know how to manage and to report and act upon those risks? Again, from my experience, most organizations are very weak or very poor from this standpoint, and what they tend to do is they fall into the routine trap of issue management, whether it's within a sponsor company as an example by themselves, or more emotionally, oftentimes, is if it's with a partner company, provider company, and those risks are not mutually addressed and effectively resolved before they become issues. So that issue firefighting mentality becomes the culture. But that has organizational implications, because therefore you are intentionally, or in most cases unintentionally, having a risk attitude or tolerance, or you're accepting risks that otherwise should be addressed because you really don't have the attitude or the tolerance for those to become issues, yet we let them become issues over and over. And therefore, we also need to understand, does the organization accept the right level of risk? Now, this is something that is also dependent on the stage, the timing of a program, or other what I'll call risk-based perspectives. So as an example, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later, if you are currently conducting a phase 3 pivotal registration trial that is critical path for the submission of a molecule and a registration package, then that is a situation where you probably have low risk tolerance, or an attitude where you do not want to accept the risk. However, if it might be an early phase exploratory study that is not critical path to any major decision point, you may be willing to accept risks that you would not have accepted on that phase 3 pivotal critical path registration trial. So therefore, you have to understand where the organization is willing to put the risks at any moment in time, and when they will accept them and when they will not. The organization, does it understand if risks are being properly managed? And I will argue that this is almost to a 90+% situation where most companies are not aware, through line management, the effective decision makers, about whether risks are being properly managed. There might be individual pockets or stakeholders who know whether a risk is being managed, but they're usually poorly communicated, and decision makers are unaware. So as a result of that, that often leads to lack of alignment and lack of proactive decisions to help the different stakeholders act upon risks to prevent them from becoming issues. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Also, does the organization have a comprehensive risk process or methodology? And so frequently when you go across, especially larger companies who have multiple assets in development, you'll find that how risk is managed from one development team to another development team to a third and a fourth are almost always very, very different. There might be a policy in place, or to some extent an SOP, and many companies now are also developing effective risk tools. However, when you actually find the behaviors around that and the consistency of those behaviors, those are oftentimes still very diverse And I'll talk about why that is the case and some opportunities to reduce that diversity, especially when that diversity is not a positive for an organization. From a cost perspective, if we look at that a little bit more deeply, there's a recognition that not all risks are alike. So we want to make sure that the organization focus on risks that matter and the risks that have a cost implication, but we'll also talk about it from a value perspective. So as a quick example, the cost of actually addressing a trial from a speed of enrollment perspective. So there may be added cost to be able to enroll more quickly into a clinical trial. So there might be barriers or resistance by an organization to expend more cost to ramp up enrollment. However, if the value proposition is considered, let's say again that's a pivotal registration trial that's critical path, if that enrollment is delayed significantly enough such that it delays the market authorization application being submitted to an agency and thereby affects the approval of a product and the launch of a product, the value proposition was not just the cost of added resources to do enrollment. The value proposition includes the lost revenue that was really the more significant factor. And therefore, sometimes if we focus only on cost, we lose that value perspective. And I'll talk more about that in a moment with value. So we need to look at the risks that matter from the cost and the value perspective. And we look at the organization about whether they have duplicating or overlapping, whether it's risk functions or capabilities, especially when quote unquote organization includes a sponsor and a provider working together. So if a provider is approaching risk differently than the sponsor, and they're not aligned on the risk approaches and how they're managing those risks, almost inevitably they will become issues and not just risks because they're not aligned on the decision-making aspects that are necessary for a unified approach to addressing those risks proactively. Also, are there automated controls versus manual controls? Almost, again, inevitably, if there are manual controls that are really used to manage this, it may not effectively be implemented because people get distracted from the priorities and the urgencies on a day-to-day basis and don't manage those manual controls. So the automated controls, if viable, become much more capable of ensuring that an organization acts effectively. Also, does the organization optimize the use of technology? And of course, our industry is recognized as not one of the most advanced in terms of technology. And we'll talk a little bit more about mapping some of those through technology. Finally, does the organization have an overall risk mitigation strategy? Many times they do at a high level, but that strategy may not be implemented effectively across an organization. Now, if we transition to value, I talked about this a little bit when I talk about cost because for me it's difficult to separate them because looking at one without the other usually leads to inappropriate decisions. And therefore, are the risks aligned to the business, the program, and the overall objective? So I already touched on this a bit, that it's not just the enrollment of a trial that might be the critical factor. It's actually the market authorization submission that is most important and actually drives the future value. So a narrow focus on short-term goals may not be the right focus, and therefore alignment on the overall business objectives are important. Also, alignment of the risk to customer service, or oftentimes in an R&D environment where we tend to exist, it's around the development program end goals. Again, an end goal is actually marketing a product, not actually just finishing a clinical trial. And sometimes this also leads to differences of approach between a sponsor and a provider, because for a provider who's only doing the clinical trial, their end goal might be finishing that trial. So they may approach risks and risk resolution differently than the sponsor, because the sponsor, their end goal is not just finishing the trial, but it's also having quality data that they can defend and manage through market applications, market authorization applications, and actually get approval and label language in the time frame that they want. So as an example, it's not only important just to enroll patients rapidly, but you'll want to enroll the correct patients as quickly as possible. So therefore, when your data come in, they are viable, intelligent, interpretable data with integrity. So those are just some examples about looking at the alignment of all the groups around the end goals. Finally, more informed decision-making can therefore be made. So the decision makers need to be tied in and mapped into the process for risk management. And I'm going to talk about that because oftentimes they are not effectively mapped in. And then finally, the last aspects are the service or the program delivery that optimizes risks needs to be tied to the funding. And I'm going to give a couple of specific examples about where that fits in. And then also the right strategies and controls to manage the right risks. We talked about that a little bit. So when we focus a little bit more on risk control and quality and compliance, the core value is really looking at optimizing the set of risk control and compliance activities. So these are the things that we look at. First is what's the cost to serve. I touched on that a bit, but I'm going to explain that more. It's minimizing the time and the resources devoted, in this case, not to the cost of doing the programs, but the cost of doing risk management in a proactive fashion. We're going to talk a little bit in a moment about barriers to doing risk management, and one of those is around the cost of resources, spending time or devoting time to doing risk planning when in fact, right at that moment, it is not urgent or it is not critical. And so there's a false sense of comfort by many that since it is not the burning platform on their day-to-day plate, it means that they can delay that or they don't need to do that. So they feel there's a cost of doing risk planning when in fact they feel they can better use their time addressing the issues of today. But what that drives is a never-ending issue management behavior and firefighting after firefighting after firefighting. Because if we never transition from that firefighting day-to-day behavior and spend devoted time preventing tomorrow's risks from becoming tomorrow's fires, then we'll just go on to the next fire and the next fire. And I think most of us emotionally and from a common sense perspective realize that issue management and issue behavior in terms of the emotions related to that and last-minute resolutions of issues usually are more costly in terms of a resource consumption and fund consumption standpoint than proactive risk prevention. So there's a cost to serve that we need to understand about risk and control and quality. Also, from a risk management and compliance perspective, the effective management of risks and compliance must be agreed upon from a risk appetite standpoint. And I talked a little bit about that. So therefore, not all risks need to have those resources tied to it. If we're proactive enough and we identify a risk that we're willing to accept and management aligns and leadership aligns to that and you document those decisions, should that risk actually arise, then you can always go back and say we had accepted that risk in terms of the appetite. Now that it is an issue, we have a contingency that we know we need to implement. However, we accepted that at that moment in time. From a scalability standpoint, this is where we get into the aspects of, for let's say a company that might be developing a single asset and they don't plan to ever develop another asset, which I would argue is probably almost zero companies, then they may not need to worry about scalability. But almost all companies need to consider scalability, meaning how do we actively work swiftly in terms of risk planning and risk mapping so that we don't start with whiteboards or white papers each and every time that we, for each of our development teams, are looking at risks. So it's really shame on us if from a perspective that we've got one team that has been through risks or issues and have developed and identified that those are risks that are likely to occur to other teams. And in fact, maybe if they've already developed a solution, it is shame on us if we haven't captured that and used that to allow swift, rapid incorporation of those risks and potential solutions into other future teams who might need to know that. And again, for most of our organizations, we find that there are silos and huge gaps between one development area and another development area, such that the sharing of risk prevention leading practices are rarely shared or benefited by one team from another team. And again, personally, I think that is a huge loss for the industry. At the same time, our risk management processes need to be agile. They cannot be rigid, and they cannot force us to say you must do this in-depth risk assessment approach for what might be a very simple situation or program. So they need to be fit for purpose, and they need to be agile to be adapted based on that. And then from a transparency standpoint, the more that we use proactive risk tools, risk plans, the more that our organization anticipates what those risks might be because they've seen them in the same format. Let's say from development team 1, development team 2, and so now that they're looking at development team number 3, they already, if they see the same risk and the same mitigation because it came from a preset leading practices, then they begin to already be prepared to make decisions that help development team number 3. And that is therefore the transparency and the relatedness and the connectedness between the teams and the decision makers becomes more transparent, more fluid, more rapid, and more agile because it's been set up as a scalable approach from a risk management perspective. Finally, before I kind of pause and take some questions, is the ICH Quality Risk Management Q9 guideline that was published in November of 2005 also highlights some key aspects of their expectations for risk management. Now, some of these things are applied to GMP environments, but the concepts are equally transferable to GCP, and we also see that more and more as inspections are occurring for GCP situations, they're looking at similar things. How are organizations managing integrity of data, quality, compliance, but also patient safety and patient well-being. And so the more that these same principles apply, the more they gain confidence that an organization was in control throughout the conduct of a clinical program. So these concepts include the aspects of risk assessment, and in that, there's aspects of risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. And in a little bit, I'm going to explain these in more detail. Once you've assessed the risk, what are the aspects of the control? There's either a reduction of that risk, or there's an acceptance of that. So you can see the regulators, based on what I shared in the last slide, they recognize that sponsors and providers may accept certain risks, especially if it's proactively documented and the explanations are clear, that even during audits, inspections, those become greater confidence for inspectors that it was a thoughtful, intentional, and intelligent decision, and therefore that acceptance might have been appropriate. And then finally, though, there's risk review, and the risk review requires events and activities to be decided so that you can actually go up and take actions to address those risks. And so those tend to be, again, the mitigations, contingencies, and other aspects that come out of those risk reviews through the stakeholders, decision makers, all being aligned. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions, and we'll pause and look at some of the aspects of the questions. So I think it's already been mentioned to you about how you can post questions. There's actually a question that I see now. It says, when a sponsor and a CRO are in a partnership, how do you see them assessing and managing risk? Who owns what responsibilities? I think from that perspective, the roles, responsibilities are not going to be the same for each and every project. It depends on the service model, and the responsibilities that have been delegated through usually a transfer of obligation or some other kind of formal clarification of the roles and responsibilities. So I don't know that there is a single answer to this. However, typically, as we've already used, and I'll use one example, if a clinical trial conduct is being passed to a CRO and enrollment is one of the key aspects that has a high risk, typically the provider takes a significant role in being responsible for that enrollment and the success of that enrollment, not only from a timeline perspective, but enrolling the right quality patients, the right type of patients, so that the data integrity are valid. But that does not mean that the provider is alone in that, because the sponsor is going to be passionately accountable and interested in that. So as a result of that, oftentimes they will jointly develop risk plans. And in fact, I strongly recommend that the risk plans, even more than other aspects of clinical operations, should be a joint activity between sponsor and provider. Because if the sponsor, who might need to make funding decisions that a provider is recommending as a mitigation, if the sponsor is not aware or aligned to the risk or understanding the risk, the provider almost inherently will get a no to a request for funding to take actions that they think would be appropriate to reduce the risk of enrollment delay. And so therefore, I think it's very effective to do joint risk management planning. And that's one of the most important activities of the joint effort between the parties. A couple other questions that have come in. One says, how do you identify risk thresholds in a very volatile stage of development, such as early clinical development, where the scientific questions change frequently? That's a great question, because oftentimes risk management is argued that it is not appropriate for early phase programs because it changes very dynamically through the course of a trial. So as an example, you might enroll the first patient, and depending on the results from that, you're going to change course of action. You might make different choices for the trial. The reality, though, is, again, risk planning must be fit for purpose. And what you'll find is that for other early phase clinical programs, almost inevitably, they've gone through the same types of situations that a new early phase clinical program is now beginning. So even though risks may not, you would not want to apply a rigid phase 3 risk solution, perhaps, to a phase 1 program. But you will almost inevitably find that there was a risk that became an issue for another phase 1 program, whereby a solution that they implemented actually could be a proactive decision that you make for your phase 1 program. And what I mean by that is you might map it into your decision mapping, your decision criteria. So therefore, you don't have to now, once the risk becomes an issue, to take several days to develop and to negotiate with the leadership across partners and so forth what your action is going to be. You could have taken that risk and predetermined a mapped solution, so that if that risk actually becomes an issue, you immediately implement it, because you don't need to take days getting those decisions. So that's another example. I'm going to take just a couple more questions. Questions are actually coming in very quickly, so this is great. But for sake of time, I'm going to take a few more and then we'll move on. It says, another question is, are there some kinds of templates or checklists for all risks available for a given activity? I'm actually going to show you a little bit later on in this presentation templates and what I call a blueprint. Instead of specifically a checklist, but the blueprint actually, I think, is a key aspect of helping teams think about what they should be considering for risks. And then there's one other question I'm going to take. It says, which risks should be mitigated under limited contingency budgets? Do you know any rule or algorithm? Actually, this is interesting. I'm going to show you some decision criteria. And I think risk management without a well-defined decision algorithm or decision approach oftentimes leads to indecision. So I think this question is actually an excellent one. And some of the risk grids that I'm going to show you are actually effective for a significant percentage of risks. However, with any risk tool, or any tool for that matter, there are flaws in some of those risk tools. And I'll talk a little bit about those in some of the programs or some of the information I'll have. But when you have, I'll call it, sufficient information to actually prompt risk decisions, and risk decisions can be effective, sometimes you don't need a very high-performing decision model. But in some cases, high-performing decision analytics might be appropriate. So if you're talking about major investment decisions, major corporate implications or risks, I would actually argue, which I'm not going to get into extensively today, that you should probably consider decision analytics. And there are organizations out there and professional groups like Decision Empowerment Institute and others who give you very thoughtful decision criteria and decision approaches to decision analytics. And as a result of that, to this question, which risks should be mitigated under limited contingency budgets, it allows you, again, through those decision analytics, or even through other proactive risk tools, to look at all of your risks simultaneously in a proactive fashion, so that you can actually make a thoughtful decision about which you will fund and which you would not fund. And therefore, it allows you to determine your risk tolerance based on that. So again, excellent questions. I'll come back to some of these maybe in a little bit when we get into some more specifics, if especially they still apply to this place where we are on the slides. With that, let me transition and move to the next slides. So first, I'm going to then talk a little bit about the elements of risk management. And I'm just going to clarify this a little bit more. We've touched on this, but I'm going to actually make sure that everybody clearly understands what we're talking about. Again, risk management, as defined here, is the combination of all the activities that are related to risk assessment, control, review, and communication. A risk management activity or plan or SOP within any organization that does not have the composite of ability to assess, control, review, and communicate is incomplete. So all of your risk management plans should have all of these components. So to that, if we look at these a little bit more, risk identification is, and this is a key word that I probably should have highlighted, is systematic. It's a use of systematic information to identify potential sources of harm. So as an example, a team might prospectively look at their trial and say, well, we have a risk of, and I'm going to use this over and over just as a quick example because it occurs a lot, that we might have enrollment risks for our program, enrollment into our patient enrollment in our trials. Well, most know that there is a risk, but if there isn't a systematic assessment to say, what's the probability? Is that an 80% probability? Is that a 20% probability? To what extent is that a risk? And as a result of that, is it some other systematic approach that says, is this an important trial? Is it something that is less important? So if you don't have a systematic decision process or identification process that maps to it, it's not going to be effective. So therefore, I recommend, and we're going to show you that, a systematic identification approach. That's also true for the assessment. You'll see that I also have the same word, a systematic process for organizing the information to be able to support the risk decisions. Because risk decisions most frequently either are made by the actual team, so if there are low funding implications or resource implications, many times the team can make those decisions themselves. However, frequently decisions cannot be made within the team itself, and they have to be taken to a leadership group who has funding authority or resource decision authority to make those decisions. So again, without a systematic common approach for that, you may find that your recommendations for proactive risk prevention are not supported through decision making because you haven't used a systematic approach. From a risk analysis standpoint, again, it needs to be defined, and you need to have a common approach to be able to articulate the analysis and the implications of the hazards. From an evaluation standpoint, then it should be mapped to these three aspects. What is the attitude? What's the appetite? And what's the tolerance for the risks? And again, I'm going to indicate that these need to be fit for purpose. And the decision makers, whether they're executives or leadership on a team or even individual project managers, they need to understand the level and attitude of that risk and that appetite. Oftentimes, this is hugely misinterpreted and confused. So as an example again, let me say that if you are enrolling a critical path, phase 3 registration trial, the risk appetite and the risk attitude for a delay in enrollment in that critical path pivotal registration trial is probably going to be extremely low. This actually empowers the team, the project managers, and the other individuals on the team to elevate this risk or to escalate this risk in a very proactive fashion and argue that this has a high probability of happening, a huge impact if it happens, and as a result of that, we should get funding for extra resources or some other aspects to be able to mitigate this risk. And you'll be in an excellent position to argue your case because you understand the attitude and the appetite for risk up and down the organization. On the flip side, it would be rather useless to, for let's say a non-critical path study that is really kind of a peripheral implication. It might be an exploratory thing that is not in the primary registration or primary goals for the program. It's more of an interesting exploratory aspect. It would be inappropriate to take the same risk of enrollment delay forward for what could be costly funding or resources. Therefore, you can understand that risk appetite and tolerance in a diverse, fit-for-purpose fashion. So that evaluation should be important in that context. As a result of that, then you begin to do one of the following two activities. You either then argue and develop risk reduction, and you manage that proactively from a very aggressive perspective, or you acknowledge the risk acceptance. And as I said, if you accept it, it is excellent to be able to document that it was aligned through leadership up and down, and then also to put it in whether it's trial master files or other aspects, so therefore even later on if you happen to be inspected, it shows a thoughtful approach to why that risk was accepted, and that it had a low risk of patient implication or low risk of other data quality perspectives. Even if the risk actually becomes an issue and you had to be reactive to address it to some extent, then it still helps the organization and others understand the thoughtfulness that went into that. So I'm going to open it up again and go back and look at some questions and see if there are additional perspectives that people have relative to this kind of an area. One of the questions that I see now, it says, is a risk mitigation plan mandatory at the beginning of a trial or expected by the health authorities? Well, I showed you the ICH Q9 guidelines. So the word mandatory and at beginning of the trial still has some subjectivity to it. So I think from my perspective, I would say they should be because of not just compliance requirements by health authorities, but actually because it is an effective business model approach. And in fact, from a total value proposition for sponsors, providers, or any other stakeholders, a culture and an organization that lives by risk prevention almost always delivers more value to all of their stakeholders, be it to the patients, to shareholders, to investigators, and to others, because anytime you can keep an issue from occurring, then almost inevitably you're going to have lower emotion, lower frustration, lower last-minute resource consumption that is actually a low effective and high cost implication, and so forth. So while it may or may not be verbally mandatory, I think it should be a very, very high priority and is very, very beneficial for all organizations involved. Another question is, it says for biosimilar phase 1, it's slightly different. It says we don't accept many changes, if I interpret the question correctly. And so when you say don't accept changes, well, risk planning actually prevents changes. And what I mean by that is a risk mitigation or risk contingency that is planned prospectively, perhaps at the beginning of a trial, should it need to be implemented, is not a change. It's actually built into the plan. So oftentimes the programs that are developed may allow you to take, a left or a right turn. Now, if you're saying that you can only take a left turn, you cannot take a right turn, still by doing the proactive risk planning up front, it allows you to do a decision process that's thoughtful, that might actually prompt you to say, well, wait a minute, the better choice is actually to take a right turn rather than a left turn. And so let's build our biosimilar phase 1 program to approach it this way rather than the other way, because that, from a risk perspective, is a better approach. So risk planning, risk prevention is still very effective from that vantage point. A couple more questions are in. It says, looking at the operational side of clinical trials, not the study-specific side, where can benchmarking information be obtained with regards to acceptable risk or thresholds across the industry? Great question. So there are consortia who are now looking at leading practices. Leading practices oftentimes are templates and tools. But there's even a desire to begin to create what I'll call, and using consortia as centers of excellence, of knowledge management. And what I mean by that is the knowledge says, if these are high risks across the industry, and here are leading practice mitigations and contingencies, then why can't, through a pre-competitive consortium, those leading practice solutions and high-risk implications be shared through pre-populated templates? So there are industry who are doing that, or consortia who are doing that. And as an example, I am with the Avoca Quality Consortium, and we are doing that right as we speak in regards to inspection readiness and some knowledge management materials that we're developing around that. And that's also very viable from a risk planning standpoint to help the industry have cross-fertilization of leading practice solutions, especially from a pre-competitive standpoint. One final question, and I'll move on. It says, what can an organization do to align risk appetite and risk tolerance? It seems that risk appetite is always higher than tolerance for realized risks. That's quite interesting, because usually our appetite on a number of things is always bigger than what we're able to actually digest once we get into it. And I think that's what I'm sensing here, is that there might be decisions made up front to say, well, we will accept that risk. But when the risk actually becomes an issue, emotions still get very high and say, well, how could it happen? We shouldn't have happened, that type of thing. And part of that comes down to aligning all of this through management and leadership. And that's actually going to be at the very end of my slide. So let's hold on to that right now, and I'll come back to that at the end with the very final slide, because to me, risk management in a very effective fashion will never work effectively to its greatest extent if it's only done at the operational level of an organization. It must be very closely tied to executive and to leadership decision models. So therefore, they are aligned to that appetite and tolerance from the very beginning. So I'll come back to that. So I'm looking at time, making sure that we're progressing, and I think we're doing fine on the time. So now I'm going to actually get into a little bit more of the specifics of what I really am excited to share with you. And these are around specific mapping of lessons learned, in this particular case, to the risk management plans. So I think that is very key for us to start talking about. So if we look at lessons learned and the processes for lessons learned, oftentimes when I start talking about lessons learned, there's kind of a a reaction. I call it an antibody type reaction, where people put up their resistance, their hands, and say, we don't want to do lessons learned. It takes too much time, etc. And so here's what we're going to talk a little bit about is lessons learned is absolutely vital for the most effective risk management. So to create a library of lessons from prior teams such that future teams can access and plan from is absolutely critical for proactive risk management. And it was even teed up in one of the questions previously that if we could share that, not just from prior teams within given companies, but across the industry, it would be even more valuable from a lessons learned perspective. It could reduce the likelihood that teams experience the same or similar issues over and over again. And I will tell you, as I spent many years in a company doing clinical development, and then now as I consult across numerous companies, be them very small biotech companies all the way up through large pharma companies, I see this. It's almost shameful that over and over the same issues, same types of issues just occur over and over, and we live that issue firefighting as our cultures within our industry. We also need to share and replicate new practices or ideas that allowed a prior project to run more smoothly. So lessons learned isn't just about identifying the issues that occurred and what went poorly or what worked, but it's also to understand why things that worked, or why if they didn't, why they didn't work. Because sometimes just because somebody implemented a solution doesn't mean it was a good solution. If it didn't actually solve it, or it was too costly for the value that it generated, it still is not a good mitigation or contingency that should be considered. So the shared learning is important. Also, we need to improve conformance to budget and timeline. And what that means is the more that we use lessons learned from prior projects, the more it helps us define what the right budgets and timelines could be, should be. It helps us defend those budgets and timelines, even between sponsor and provider, where oftentimes there's huge debate around budgets and timelines, but even within given companies and teams. And therefore, it allows us to effectively use not just anecdotal information, but actual information through lessons learned to improve the quality and future project execution and the defense of budgets and timelines. Also, by default, if we use them effectively, it'll reduce the number of negative surprises on future projects because we knew they've occurred on the prior projects. So again, why should we be letting them occur on future projects? So I'd like to go ahead and transfer, and I think at this point, Kristen, you may take control back to do a couple polling questions, and then we'll come back and we'll share some further thoughts on this. So Kristen? Okay. So the polling question is, to what extent does your organization effectively conduct lessons learned activities? Your options are to a great extent, to a moderate extent, to some extent, or not at all. So if you would go ahead and respond. So Kristen, whenever you think the responses are in, you can show the results. Okay, so as I see the results here, about a little over half of the people say that their organization does do lessons learned, but only to some extent. There are a number, a third of the population here, say that they do it to a moderate extent. So that's actually pretty good. But you can tell that only about 1 out of every 10 of the respondents here indicate that they do an extensive amount of lessons learned. So potentially opportunities to further that. I think there's another polling question. So Kristen, if you bring up the next polling question. Okay, so this is, what is your primary barrier to your ability to conduct effective lessons learned activities? Do you hear arguments that there's not enough time? Is it a fear of identifying mistakes? It is extra work with little value. It is difficult to share lessons learned with other development teams. Management does not support it. There are other priorities. Or is there risk relative to audit inspections or other legal aspects? Okay, so you see it's fairly evenly split with time, not surprisingly, not enough time. It's interesting that that is a common argument, not enough time, and that is unfortunate because usually that is, again, it's a part of proactive risk prevention by doing the lessons learned. Oftentimes, though, it's not going to benefit the immediate team who just went through the situation. And therefore, for them, they have other priorities or urgent needs to move on to the next phase of their project. And they're not as focused on actually capturing lessons learned that might help the next team do better. In reality, though, most team members ultimately will be doing a future project where they might get to the same stage. And if they've not thoughtfully captured the lessons learned, they might also be doing a detriment for themselves. The other two areas that are high is it is difficult to share lessons learned with other development teams. I'm going to show you a great way for that to be enhanced. And it says there are other priorities, and that's almost undoubtedly, again, tied to not enough plan or enough time, and that's because the other priorities immediately pull you away. But we're going to show you again where actually this can be done efficiently and effectively so that there is not an actual need to do that in terms of a lot of time and energy to do lessons learned. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go on just to highlight that some of the things you've mentioned here are in fact very common. So barriers to effective lessons learned. Some people are afraid to admit a mistake. Processes may be too complicated. And if the lessons learned process is too complicated, then let's make it simpler, but let's make it effective. And you can see others that we saw, for instance, here is that, sometimes management only pays lip service to it. They don't really support it, or it's too general. So there's legal risks. Some have a concern about that, but there are ways that we will be talking about addressing those. Also, it's important to recognize that lessons learned is not intended to be finger pointing, or it's not about being nitpicky about specific situations, and you also don't want to be defensive about it. So those are opportunities for us to actually recognize that lessons learned is a very, very beneficial part of proactive risk management. So what are the leading practices for lessons learned? And contrary to only using a post-mortem approach to learning from past mistakes, effective lessons learned actually is a process through the lifespan of a project. And it's actually, there's learning before, there's learning during, and there's learning after. So it's an acronym of an LBDA framework. It's been shown to be very effective for organizations to optimize the operational performance, to actually reduce errors and to do them early to avoid costs and a lot of resource consumption. So best practices really incorporate lessons learned at multiple levels. They can be at the project level in terms of incorporating, but it's also implementing them at the overall program level in addition to the project level. And even more importantly, and this gets to one of the questions that was posed earlier, there's an opportunity from an enterprise standpoint, which is across all programs, for enterprise decisions and also proactive leadership awareness of what teams might be bringing forward for risk prevention decisions, because the enterprise is aware of those risks in a very quantitative, viable fashion, and they know the most effective, cost-effective, and value-effective solutions. From an organizational impact, it is very effective in terms of mitigating schedule delays or cost overruns. And in fact, actually, by sometimes investing more cost from an expense from a risk standpoint, actually reduces overall cost for the entire program, because usually rescue missions or last-minute fixes are more costly than what a proactive risk solution would have cost in the first place. So if your enrollment, as an example, is actively, let's say, 40% behind on a pivotal registration trial that's critical path, the last-minute efforts to get the enrollment up are almost always going to be more costly and less effective than what would have been done if something had been done proactively. And I'm actually going to share you a couple of examples of that here in a moment. Also decreasing the learning curve among project teams and also by management. So you don't have to re-educate leaders, the decision makers, over and over, because they've been informed. And it's part of the routine process of risk management. And because they're informed, it makes it easier for each team to defend what they're asking for from a mitigation and funding and resourcing perspective. And also this one here, as you can see, the IT project specifics was for this source that I pulled this from, but it's generally applicable, is that reversal of systemic negative trends overall are also applicable. So here's what learning before, during, and after looks like, is that learning before is actually scanning and accumulated lessons learned. So that's where, again, the lessons learned becomes important for previous projects, and mapping those to, from a due diligence perspective, to say what can likely occur on our future projects. So develop an optimized structure for their project. So if a current team is early in their development and they actually scan lessons learned from other teams, they've got it at their fingertips. They don't need to experience it themselves. Learning during is that through peer assistance and rapid communications, the resolutions and innovations can be implemented, and best practices throughout the project team and stakeholders can be educated, because it's being done real time and not in a retrospective fashion. But that afterward is still important, because even as we've had those experiences and we've come to the outcome and we've gathered that in a systematic way, then that allows us to again map those and reapply those for our own future teams, if I'm an individual on a team, and or for other teams. And therefore the lessons learned provides materials that are exhaustive for positives and negatives, and allows replication of effective solutions and avoiding the pitfalls. So we've touched on that already. So there are 4 key steps, and you're going to see this show up in some schematics that I'm going to show you here in a moment. So lessons learned processes, there's a proactive aspect of utilizing knowledge from prior projects, capturing those risks and corresponding lessons on an ongoing project and mapping those to proactive decisions, disseminating them across the organization so that they are prepared to act upon those proactive decisions, and then modifying the current practices based on those decisions to make permanent implementation of those and the knowledge gained. So I'm going to show you here in a cyclical fashion how that maps to each other. And this is going to get into the heart of what I think is the most critical pieces that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So as we conduct the lessons learned, which I just talked about, that then gets mapped into a database. Now, for many companies, you start to cringe and say, well, we can't afford to build a database. We can't afford to devote the energy to create some kind of centralized system. Well, this database can be a program database for efficiency that allows rapid sorting, searching, etc., for certain types of risks and mapping to project plans and so forth. But it's not necessary. Again, it can be fit for purpose. So if you are a large company and you find that a little bit of investment for a database is worth the investment to be able to map it to all teams proactively and to time it from a push perspective. And what I mean by that is lessons learned can take two aspects. One is it can go into a database, and the database, or an Excel spreadsheet, and that's what I mean, it can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, especially if that's applicable or appropriate for, let's say, small companies who may only have a couple assets in development. A spreadsheet may be appropriate. But in that spreadsheet or database perspective, if it is difficult to find appropriate, relevant lessons learned, and or it is a passive approach where teams have to know when to come and look for those lessons learned, almost inevitably it's going to have far less utilization and value than if there is an opportunity to push the information out to teams in an intelligent fashion, in an intelligent point in time. So as an example, if the database knows that project number E is now at a stage that projects A, B, C, and D were at in prior time periods, it can recognize when those risks became issues for projects A, B, C, and D, and the database can actually push that lessons learned out to project team E weeks or months in advance to say, these other teams face this issue. It's probably a risk for you. You should probably be developing a mitigation contingency plan. And oh, by the way, team number D developed our leading practice solution. You might want to consider to see if this is your solution. So as a result, these databases of uploaded lessons learned become very viable to actually become an automated process. And that goes back to one of the comments I made earlier, automated versus manual, because manual is far less effective from lessons learned and risk management from a proactive standpoint than automated. What that then gets to in the third box here is that allows a pre-populated risk matrix. So by having common risks that have high implications in terms of impact or probability, and have leading practice solutions already developed by other teams, by pre-populating a risk matrix, it allows that pushing of those insights back out to the teams in utilization. And as a result, as an example, the next box, the AQC, the Avoca Quality Consortium, is one of the organizations. Transcelerate is another, where we have leading practices in terms of risk mitigations and risk templates tools. And as I said, we're even beginning to build practices for pre-populated insights as well that will be available for the industry. Finally, you can then take that and you apply it to your new study or your new project team at a fit for purpose and appropriately time relevant period of time. Therefore, the teams don't feel like they're wasting their time on something that is way out in the future and or they perceive low risk at the moment. It actually is it's a just in time. It brings it to them when it's relevant and it prompts them to recognize the value for them. Therefore, they capture the lessons learned. They can ramp it up into their team members. They educate their team members about the current risks and the solutions, and they actually upload and utilize those. And based on then their own lessons learned, it goes back into conducting their own lessons learned processes, and it becomes a cyclical process. From another vantage point showing that, some people prefer flow diagrams versus that cyclical diagram. And you'll see those four aspects of what I had indicated on the prior slide in terms of the critical aspects of that. Here, they're basically, again, the project team recognizes, identifies the lessons learned. They conduct the lessons learned review, and it can incorporate those from a stage gate perspective. The stage gate is at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end of their programs. And then they can actually then have it mapped into the lessons learned processes. It gets uploaded into the systems, therefore you get pre-populated databases and systems and so forth. So this is another depiction, and probably actually a more detailed and content-specific description about how that can play out. So these slides will be available to you after this webinar, and you'll be able to look at these and kind of see if this maps into a process flow diagram or a process and procedure that you might like to develop. So I'm going to open it up to questions again. I'm going to take a few questions, and then I'll move on to make sure we hit, I think, the actual most critical aspects of our presentation here in terms of making sure you get an effective risk management approach. So one of them here says, what can an organization, I think we already answered that question, so let me look at the next one here. In your experience, which is more effective, an organization-wide lessons learned library or a project function level library? That's a great question, and I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. I think there is benefit to both, especially if they are mapped well. So what I mean by that is, and I'll say this a little facetiously, but also in a realistic way, is I always hear that oncology is different. So some of the risks or mitigations for non-oncology therapeutic areas may or may not be applicable to an oncology environment. So therefore, having a project or function level or specific area might be more appropriate in that particular case. Also, from a pure function perspective, having a data management, as an example, functional specific library could be very effective and very important. And in fact, could get to a level of specificity that individual teams may or may not be interested in doing. At the same time, there's going to be some broad brush organization-wide lessons learned that actually are effective. So as an example, enrollment. While enrollment might be perceived as a function specific for clinical operations or the groups that work with that part of a clinical program, it actually is best to have an organization-wide awareness of that, because leadership may, and I'm going to show you that here in just a moment, from a mitigation standpoint, you may want the highest levels of the organization prepared proactively to know when they need to add additional funding or resources to your program, because it's a vital program or it's a pivotal registration trial, as an example. So therefore, I think both can be effective. And in fact, we've worked with a company, we're working with them right now. I won't name them, but we're working with a company where these are being mapped both. They're being function specific, but it's mapping to an enterprise level risk management tool as well. So they've chosen the same template, and the risk tools are mapping both functional level and enterprise level. Couple more questions. What is your suggestion for ensuring that lessons learned do not fall into a forgotten, unknown space? I've touched on that to some extent. It's the primary thing is you have to make it value added. The way to make it value added is to map it into a blueprint of a risk grid. If lessons learned just get captured into a database that is difficult to search, difficult to find, and is only a passive lessons learned process, inevitably, from my experience, it will not succeed. It has to become an active, push-oriented lessons learned that formally gets mapped to risk plans that are blueprinted, that get pushed out to teams, so therefore they become living and meaningful. So I'll take one more question here. It says on this, and then I'll move to the end, and then I can take as many as possible toward the end. What are the tools typically used for documenting the lessons learned? I'm guessing these will not be saved in eTMF. Otherwise, these might be targets for an audit extension. And there's differing opinions on that. Again, I think you would not want the detailed lessons learned. You would not want your general database of lessons learned and so forth captured in a trial master file. However, if there was a very intentional decision by a given project or a given team that was based on a proactive risk plan and risk approach, those are usually effective, especially if it's an effort to document why a decision was made, because the trial master file oftentimes makes or does document decisions that were made, but sometimes those decisions were made off of little or poor information. Whereas if you're using effective lessons learned and proactive risk planning, then those decisions are more founded in information, knowledge, and insight, and therefore documenting that decision based on that knowledge and insight can actually allow you to defend from an inspection or audit perspective why that was the right choice to make, and therefore it helps you manage the inspectors at that moment in time. So with that, I'm going to move to the last portion of our presentation here, where it gets into the real aspects of implementing real risk management and mapping. So I'm going to actually show you some images. It's going to be difficult to see initially right here. I'm just showing you full images of risk tools, but then I'm going to dive into and show you a little bit more in depth here in a moment. So as an example, Avoca Quality Consortium has a risk module, and this is what it looks like. So it has sections and areas to capture risks. It has areas to quantify the probability and the impact of those risks. It has areas to identify the mitigations and contingencies, as well as triggers that prompt the team to know at the appropriate time when they should be considering implementing the mitigation or measuring and evaluating if that risk is beginning to become an issue. So this is a common type of formatted tool. This one is a leading practice that the Avoca Quality Consortium has. Transcelerate also has their risk tool that many of you are familiar with, and it also is similar in nature and has some pre-populated components as well. What we've learned, though, in most cases, it is effective to have those risk tools programmed through macros or other mechanisms to actually generate risk management diagrams. And this is one example of one, and I'm going to show you one in just a moment. But it's to identify the magnitude and the probability, because these are effective, simple communication tools to help defend or present to decision makers why you want them to address certain risks. So by doing this risk grid, if it automatically then populates a risk grid such as this that shows which of those risks that are toward the upper right portion of this, those are inevitably going to probably be risks that you should very much proactively mitigate. Risks that are down on the lower end here in the lower left might be risks that you're willing to argue should be accepted. So a tool like this allows you to appropriately approach or focus people's attentions and decision makers' attention on the right aspects of what they're doing. So here's what we do, though, in terms of using those, what I showed you is blank templates, into an active blueprint, especially from a lessons learned optimization standpoint. So what is most appropriate, and this can usually only be done if you have a center of excellence or if you have a designated process lead person designated who owns this. If you don't have anybody centrally within an organization or within a program or a set of programs, then inevitably an individual team is very unlikely to develop and live off of blueprints that help the organization repeat leading practice implementations of solutions. But what the blueprint is a knowledge management tool. It's where you actually retain and manage the knowledge regarding prior program risks and the leading practice mitigations and solutions. As I said, it serves as a center of excellence, even the tool itself. And as I said, even consortia, such as the Avoca Quality Consortium, may be in positions to actually serve as a center of excellence for our member companies. And this is especially helpful for companies who don't have the resources available within their own companies to have that center of excellence or to have a resource focus on doing this process. So there may be potentials to do that, but there are accountable stakeholders to create and manage those blueprints. From an ongoing evaluation perspective, it allows recurring high risk to be identified, high impact to recognize when they become issues so that you can put timing and triggers to make sure that they don't become issues for future teams. Leading practice mitigations and contingencies become a part of that. But also it ensures consideration of those common high-impact risks by all teams. And also, I highlight the word "and" also for process improvements. So even processes, so the organizations or members of the organization who are accountable for processes, process owners, can also benefit from this to actually improve their processes. Because if there are process components that cause risks to become issues over and over again, they can address it through processes. So here's an example of a pre-populated lessons learned risk grid. So I'm going to give you a couple of very quick examples. So from a patient enrollment risk perspective, you may have data within your organization, and this can, again, only occurs perhaps through lessons learned, that 75% of your company trials have enrollment delays of at least 3 months. So if that's a real data point for your company, that would be important to know. Now, if this trial that you're considering is actually your critical path primary registration trial, then it's shame on you to allow that to have a 75% chance of enrollment delay. So therefore, you have a high probability of occurring. The impact is huge. If you're starting this trial, as I indicate here, let's say in the next day, 3 months from now, you might be in this situation, and so that's the risk to issue timing. And therefore, it identifies it and allows you to ramp it up to management as a high-risk situation that they should address. Another quick example is study drug supply risk. So you, again, may know that if enrollment is more than a certain percent above plan, you may have your study drug, let's say, has a short stability life at this point. Let's say it's an early phase 1 or phase 2 trial, and you haven't yet got stability data that allows you to have a long period of time for that product to remain out in the field within your clinical sites. So you have to manage a very tight supply management. In that case, you don't want to find that your enrollment's actually ahead of schedule, and because of that, you now have to suspend sites from enrolling patients because you can't get study drug there. So it also identifies it as a risk proactively, but because these are high impact, high value risks, it allows you actually then to develop mitigation plans and even contingency plans that prospectively obtain management approval for funding and resources to identify and select and start up 20% additional investigative sites. Might be an example of a mitigation. Now, if your leadership is mapped and tied to this, and they're accustomed to seeing this type of format and tool, and in fact, this is a blueprint. What I mean by blueprint is it's been captured by prior teams. Your management now is aware of this. So now that you are, let's say, development team E, you're coming in and saying, wait a minute, development teams A, B, C, and D had this become issues. This is our critical path pivotal registration trial. We can't allow that to happen. So it gives you a great position as a new team E to go in and defend to your management that they give you additional funding and approval to get a 20% additional sites pre-approved and added to your trial over what the feasibility assessment might have been recommended by the CRO. So in this particular case, it allows a team to use that historical information, that knowledge management, to proactively gain management support when otherwise they may find that historically they don't even try to get it pre-approved because they get a negative response. So in this case, using fit for purpose, appropriate utilization of this, they can get that. You'll see here there's examples for contingencies, and there's also an example here for mitigation for the study drug supply. And for sake of time, I'm actually going to move on just to indicate that we have some the aspects of covering that here. For sake of time, I'm actually going to avoid this polling question. I'm actually going to move on. Here's just another quick image of the risk matrix for risk mapping. This is a different type of tool. It's similar to the one I showed you before, but it's an effective one to use to get line management and executives aligned with your decision recommendations and why you want them to address those that are in the red categories, and why you want them to accept and document their acceptance of the risk of those in the low category. So finally then, I will just say here is the final key statement I'm going to make, and then I'll just open it for any remaining questions at the end. You've heard me say teams being aligned with management decision makers is vital for lessons learned and risk mapping and risk management to be effective. So the only way, from my observation and my experience, that risk management and lessons learned ultimately achieves and becomes a culture within an organization is when leadership and management visibly and actively sponsors and sets the expectations for ongoing and proactive risk management, and when they actively monitor and detect and proactively support those behaviors over reactive issue management. So they have to reward that behavior, and they do not reward reactive issue resolutions if an issue arose due to poor proactive risk prevention. And what I mean by that is our culture is this. Traditionally, it is easy to see I call them the Lone Ranger, who runs in, charges in, and saves the day on an issue, when in fact that Lone Ranger might have been the reason that that issue arose in the first place, because he or she did not proactively prevent it from happening when it could have been prevented. So in that case, rewarding that Lone Ranger for coming in and at the last moment throwing a high expense, high energy, high emotional fix, but solving it, should not be rewarded as much as somebody who actively documented, went forward and got pre-approval for management to prevent the risk from happening in the first place, and by doing so then get rewarded by management because it was documented and recognized that they prevented a high probable, high impact risk from ever occurring on their team. So that management behavior must be proactive, not only in rewarding those behaviors, but finally, and this is my last comment, is proactively support real leading practice mitigations for projects, including funding decisions and resource decisions, and removing barriers that teams ask them to remove. So those are the key aspects. So with that, are there any remaining questions? And Kristen, you can tell me if we're out of time or if I have a chance to answer one or two questions. Okay, so just maybe take one or two here real quick and then we'll close. One of the questions is, for communicating lessons learned to a study team starting a new trial, would you recommend incorporating this into the pre-trial training? The sponsor could incorporate this into aspects of, let's say, the kickoff meetings and so forth. Absolutely. I think it's vital for them to be as part of the pre-trial training, and definitely for kickoff meetings with partnered alliance projects and so forth. Another question is how to write lessons learned from inspection findings without repeating the observation. Is there a way to transform an audit or inspection finding into a lessons learned? That's a great question. And the answer is yes. I think it's clearly, if it's been found through an audit or inspection on prior projects, again, it would be a real discredit for future teams not to be aware and to act upon that. Now, you don't want to document it and say these are audit or inspection findings. That shouldn't probably be in the lessons learned or in the risk management tool itself. But you can certainly flag them as high impact, and therefore they get the attention they need because you just document what that risk is, and you document it as high impact, which bubbles it to the attention category that they respond to it. Because obviously, if it's an inspection finding, it is a high impact, and an unfortunate one that you don't want to have repeated for future projects. I'll take one last question. It says, to some individuals, turning fire off would look easier to deal with than to implement a risk management tool. Any advice to change the mindset? Well, from my experience, those who feel that turning the fire off is easier haven't experienced real risk management. So what I mean by that is real risk management, when done effectively through what I've just indicated, does not take a lot of proactive time. It does not take a lot of energy because, again, their experience might be that they start with whiteboards and just brainstorm all the potential risks and then brainstorm the mitigations. And yeah, that can take a lot of time. But if you've got a proactive process that maps lessons learned from other teams into a blueprint, all you're doing is you're going through a preset blueprint and saying, yes, does this apply to us? Or no, it doesn't. You know, tick, 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 and it's very rapid. So the energy consumption of doing proactive risk management when you have this full cycle, full process, is not nearly as resource intensive. And they would experience that as what most situations are when you need to turn off a fire. So with that, I hope this has been helpful for everybody, and I will close and turn it back to Kristen for any final comments. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. That was excellent, an outstanding presentation. I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending out the PDF version of the slides as well as the recorded version. And just one more reminder that we are offering a related conference, our Clinical Quality Oversight Forum, of which Steve is a part, which is taking place in October, the 17th and 19th in Philadelphia. And we'll go ahead and send that email out later this afternoon that includes the PDF version of the slides, as well as the recorded audio version of the entire webinar. So you can listen to it again at your own convenience or share it with your colleagues. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My information will be in that email. Thank you again, Steve. Excellent job. Thank you, everybody. Bye.